feel very welcome to this research seminar at the Institute for Future Studies. My name is Gustav Arrhenius. I will just speak very briefly because this seminar with Julia Steinberger is going to be led by Malcolm Fairbrother, who is actually arranging a workshop on green growth that's going on now. And Julia is part of that, but we made this an open research seminar for more people. And this workshop is part of the big climate ethics research project that we have at the Institute. That's been going on for a couple of years and will go on for another 3 years. So this is, of course, if you think about climate ethics, then you will have to start to think about green growth. So without further ado, I'll give the word to Malcolm.
Thanks, Gustav. Just before I introduce our speaker, a couple of housekeeping points. As usual, we're going to request that people keep questions for the end, unless you have something that you'd like to ask in the middle, just to clarify something that you think will be better answered quickly or immediately rather than later. So if you do want to ask a question in the middle, you can use the chat function, and Joe and I will be kind of monitoring that, and we'll interrupt Julia. Otherwise, we'll leave her to finish her presentation, and we'll take questions at the end in the usual way. I believe, as usual, we're recording this, and I think we'll be recording the first half hour of the Q&A. So up until into 30 minutes into the Q&A, we'll record this. If you, for some reason, want to ask a question but not be recorded, you can leave your question till the latter part of the question and answer period. And I'll repeat this, but we'll use the usual hand and finger process as well. I think that's it for housekeeping issues. So I'm going to introduce our speaker. It's my great pleasure to introduce Julia Steinberger, who's a professor in the Institute of Geography and Sustainability at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. She researches and teaches in the interdisciplinary fields of ecological economics and industrial ecology, examining connections among resource use, energy use, pollution, economic activity, and human well-being. She received her PhD in physics, I believe, at MIT in the US, but then she moved to Europe and changed fields. She worked in places like Zurich and Vienna, for example, studying sustainable cities and the links between material use and economic performance. She moved to the UK, and while she was based at Leeds University, Professor Steinberger was a lead author of the IPCC Third Working Group's contribution to the Sixth Assessment Report. In today's seminar, she is going to tell us about the Living Well Within Limits project, I think synthesizing a variety of findings from that. And without further ado, I will hand over to her and say thank you very much for coming and talking to us, and we really look forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much, Malcolm. Thanks, Gustav. Thanks, Kim. Thanks, everybody, for being here. And indeed, we will get right into it. I should probably say something right off the bat, which is that I'm very grateful to be part of a workshop on green growth, but I do not consider myself to be somebody who believes that green growth is possible. So I'm firmly part of the degrowth side of things. So maybe that's something to think about as we go through this. But I think it's really good that we're talking to each other. Okay, so this is great. I hope you can see my screen, and I hope you can hear me. Is it good? It's working. Fantastic. So happy. Okay, so let's get right into it. So basically, I'm just going to tell you a bit about the Living Well Within Limits project. This is a project that I acquired in 2016, so it started in 2017. We're in our final year, and what this means for what we do. So I usually try to have some part of the climate context, because I think that this really sort of changes, thinking about the climate context changes how we do research. So I just want to start with this. I basically will just start with some basics from the scientific basis for the climate emergencies. So I think the Special Report on 1.5 degrees of the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, helps us see this quite clearly. There are reasons why this report is clearer than others. If you want, we can talk about that.
We need somebody to mute in the background. I'm not sure whose that is.
Yeah, I've muted them. Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I just have to say I'm a lead author on the current report that we're writing, so I did not participate in this one. And so basically the point of this special report is to basically tell policymakers and governments about what the heck they signed up to in the Paris Agreement, because in the Paris Agreement, they signed up to somewhere between 2 and 1.5 degrees, typical UN compromise language, but they don't know if 2 degrees is already too dangerous, and they don't really know what the difference means. So because it's such a small difference in temperature for us, but what does it mean on the scale of the planet? And when you look at impacts and so the report is full of them. These are just some sort of hand-picked ones across impact categories, so some important impact categories. You really see a huge difference. So the first thing to understand is that we're already at 1.2 degrees of warming. So we're already well on our way to 1.5 degrees. You can see, I won't go through all of them, but you can see that it's a very nonlinear. The damage functions, or whatever you want to call them, are very nonlinear. So the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is very large. So, 2 degrees impacts are, 2.5 times worse, 10 times worse, 3 times worse. Or for coral reefs, it's the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is really a difference between still existing and total extinction. So we're in this sort of very urgent situation where we're already very close to already having significant impacts, but we're on our way to a lot worse. And we now know since this report in quite a bit of detail how much worse. Very often in the past, people have said, oh, you talk about climate, but biodiversity is important too. They're not actually that different in terms of both their drivers. So the drivers of biodiversity laws include climate, and the drivers of climate change include things that also cause biodiversity loss, like deforestation. And this is just for terrestrial life forms. You can see that depending on what temperature we're heading for, the impact on biodiversity is really enormous, in the sense that what this means for these species to be at risk of extinction, it means that they lose half of their range due to climate change by the end of the century. So you can see that staying below 2 degrees becomes quite important. If we head for 3 degrees or more, we're talking about half of plants and insects currently existing on the planetary surface being at risk of extinction. Anybody could realize this is extraordinarily bad news and will not lead to anything good for human populations. And as you might know, we're breaking, despite the Kyoto Accord, despite the Paris Accord, we're constantly breaking new records of emissions, except for 2020, where we had a bit of a dip thanks to a pandemic, that's obviously kind of a joke. And the point is that the Paris Agreement kind of brings us, despite the fact that governments have signed the Paris Agreement, we're still heading for upwards of 3 degrees if you look at committed policies, a bit below if you're optimistic about new commitments. But we're certainly we're not heading to below 2 degrees. We're certainly not heading to 1.5. So there's this real disconnect between how bad we know the situation is, how fast we're going towards non-desirable futures, and what we can do to change it. So this is the issue here. So basically, we've left the Holocene, which was the time since the last ice age, very narrow temperature range during which we could develop agriculture and things like that are kind of good for us. And we're really heading into a dangerous and unknown future. The reason I'm telling you this whole story is because there's a reason we are where we are today in this dangerous, in this sort of desperate stage where we're already seeing significant climate impacts, where we know that things are getting a lot worse, where we're already very close to dangerous levels of climate change. And that's because we are in a future that was created for us. That future is an economic product of a certain industry. Now, this graph is a graph that was not made public. It was published in an internal report in the 1982, and it was published by ExxonMobil. So they predicted the trajectory that we would be on. So if you look at the left side of the plot, it's showing the predictions for carbon dioxide concentrations. You see the predictions for temperature on So the left-hand side is carbon dioxide concentrations, the right-hand side is temperature. And basically this industry knew exactly what future they were driving us into. So our future and our present and our current direction is an economic product, is an industrial product of a certain industry. And they knew exactly what they were doing. And then they hid this report. They did not publish it. They did not share it with politicians, with investors, with customers. What they did is they invested millions of dollars every year into climate disinformation and climate denial and attacking scientists and delaying action, which they are still doing to this day. So we are in this very sort of conflictual situation, and we have to do research in that context. So we have to act as people and as our jobs and whatever we want to do, we have to act in this context of knowing where we are and who brought us here. So what does this mean for research? What this means for research from my perspective is that we know our CO2 emissions kind of have to fall off a cliff. We know the next few years are the most important in our history, not just the most important in, like the past 100 years, the most important probably in the history of our species, because we're entering climates that our species has never known, in fact. And the implications for me are that we need this urgent and large-scale action, radical emissions reductions, getting to zero or close within the next 20 years or so. And the fastest and surest way to do that is to reduce consumption. And reducing consumption doesn't require that much new technology or infrastructure, but there's very little research that goes in this direction on how consumption can be reduced while preserving or enhancing well-being. So how we can ramp down our level of demand for energy, for fossil fuels, while preserving and enhancing well-being. And the sort of tagline of Kevin Anderson in Manchester, but I guess he's also at Lund, is that we haven't even tried mitigation yet. So as a result, I came up with this framework for the Living Well Within Limits project, basically trying to do research to try to understand how resource use and well-being are interlinked. And you start on the left with the biophysical processes, so planetary processes, natural resources. On the right-hand side, you have social outcomes, which are needs satisfiers and well-being. So it's a certain understanding of well-being that I'll get into. And in the middle, you have a really key thing is that we're not looking just at the economy. We're not looking just at GDP. We're looking at provisioning systems, and provisioning systems are both social and physical. We give ourselves the permission to study them in an integrated way. And they are provisioning systems. Maybe it's just interesting to note are the unit of study of heterodox economics. So heterodox economics is the study of provisioning systems. So this is absolutely not mainstream economics. So let's look a bit more closely at well-being. I heard the word ethics said. Let's go straight to it. So, and you might have heard that my training was in physics. Physicists know nothing about well-being. I had to learn about it from books. So, welcome to ancient Greece. It's very undignified when you do this work because you have to pick fights, academic fights with authors who've been dead for a long time. I feel that that's always a little bit undignified. Anyway, but Aristotle in the Ethics basically talked about what his vision of well-being, and his vision was to live life as, obviously this is paraphrased and summarized, live life as fully as possible and to flourish within one's society. So it's flourishing within society. It's the sense of human potential. Okay, so that sounds very nice. But just a few decades later, you have this view of Epicure who comes along and has a very different perspective on well-being. And if you like the Greek words, Aristotle is eudaimonic, Epicure is hedonic. And I'm just going to give you the cartoon version basically here. So well-meaning means achieving the most positive and the least negative feelings possible. And you might recognize that perspective on well-being as the one that is currently dominant in our societies. That's the one that might seem familiar to you. And like all good academic disputes, you keep it going for millennia if possible. So this one's already entering, I don't know how to count, maybe it's third millennia. So the camps persist to this day. So you have to choose a team. If you're on Team Epicure, so the hedonic team, you view well-being as maybe, you might conceptualize it as happiness. It's a very individually focused perspective. You might measure it as the happiness indicator that people do research with. Even the UN publishes a global happiness report. In economics, you might translate it as the utility function. We're utility maximizers. That's how we achieve well-being. And the perspective on the economy is it's very congruent with economic growth in mainstream economics, because the basic idea is that you have more income, you can buy more stuff with more income. The reason you buy stuff is to increase your utility, so you have more positive feelings, so growth is good. And that is that is the absolutely dominant perspective right now, even in its cartoon format. If you're on Team Aristotle, your perspective is going to be extremely different. So you might conceptualize well-being as flourishing. It's a social perspective. So well-being is something that happens socially and is facilitated socially. You might measure it through the Human Development Index or the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So it's a multidimensional thing. You rely on several different things going on. And your view of the economy is much more one of development. The idea is that you want your economy to support human potential. So this is the view of Amartya Sen. The economy is there to serve human potential, not the other way around. And in the Living Well Within Limits, so the LiLi project, we read up on this stuff and we decided we were Team Aristotle, and we wrote a couple of articles. If you want to sort of know more about how we translate these theories into climate and energy and resource use, you can read more. And I think we've hopefully helped make things a little bit simpler. Now, of course, theory is nice, but can we test it? So can we empirically look at what Aristotle's theory, is it true? Like, is there any basis for it? So we're using a sort of updated version or a more recent version of this eudaimonic or Aristotelian view of well-being, which is the Theory of Human Need of Doyle and Guff, which is a book that they published in 1991. And the idea here is that well-being is conceptualized as being facilitated by the satisfaction of a finite number of non-substitutable, multidimensional, and satiable human needs that are universal through time and space. So that's a lot of words, but basically it means you got several things and you're going to depend on all of them, but only up to a certain amount. Once they're satisfied, you're good. So that's the idea here. And the question is, can we test it? So what we did, so this is a paper that was published in 2018, and this result is in the supplementary information. Always look at the supplementary information. It's got the interesting stuff. What we did is we had collected international data across as many countries as we could. And we basically looked in those countries if they had achieved, on average, need satisfaction across multiple dimensions. So we had 9 dimensions of human need satisfaction. And if a country achieved 5, then we would put it in the bucket of 5. And then we took all the countries that had achieved 5 human need satisfiers and we averaged their life satisfaction. And so we did that across the board. And this is what the result shows. So what you can see is that, we were flabbergasted. We were really amazed by this result. We had no idea anything. So we expected something to come out, but nothing so clean. So I would say that shows a really compelling view for this sort of this well-being perspective, where that well-being is based on human need, a finite number of non-substitutable, satiable human need satisfiers. We did the same thing for physical health, so for healthy life expectancy, and the relationship is stronger. But actually, some of the human needs we measured, obviously, after a certain while, it doesn't. There's a saturation. At some point, things don't matter as much for physical health. So we thought that was interesting, and also bolsters our case for using this theory. Then we tried to look at whether or not living well within limits was possible internationally. And so we're looking at the Safe and Just Space for Humanity of Kate Raworth. I hope everybody is familiar with her theory by now. But the basic idea is it's a strong sustainability framework. You're trying to achieve social foundations. So that's the inner ring of the donut. You don't want to fall down in the middle of the donut, because if you fall down in the middle, it's a hole. And it's a hole where there's real deprivation for real people, poverty, hunger, etc. So you want to achieve all your social foundations across these needs effectively. And you also don't want to be going above the environmental ceiling and crashing through planetary boundaries. So we looked for this. We have a whole bunch of indicators. We translated them to per capita boundary levels, and showing the result for Germany because that's what I had. Sweden won't be very different. I hope we'll see Sweden on the next plot. But you can see that Germany is transgressing basically 5 out of 7, is it, of the boundaries, but achieving most of the social foundation, or all of the social foundations. Well done. And another country, which is, in this case, it's Sri Lanka, doesn't transgress any biophysical boundaries, but at the same time, you can see a lot of deprivation in the social foundations. So unfortunately, those 2 countries are reasonably representative. There you go. So you can see Sweden. It's just down to the side of Germany. So basically, we're just plotting countries on this plot. The more biophysical boundaries you transgress, the further to the right you are. The more social thresholds you achieve, the higher you are. And you can see the 2 countries I just discussed. They're reasonably representative. If you don't transgress many biophysical boundaries, you tend not to achieve many social thresholds. If you achieve lots of social thresholds, you tend to transgress a lot of biophysical boundaries. And it is possible to be the worst of both worlds. That is entirely within the realm of the parameter space that's occupied. So you can transgress lots of biophysical boundaries and have very little to show for it socially as well. But the only neighborhood is here is where we need to be. And then our research question becomes, how do we go from here to there? And that's what I'm going to talk about next, is this idea that we are all developing countries. How do we change and fast? And consumption has a lot to do with that. One of the reasons consumption has a lot to do with that is because of distribution. So there's a lot of inequality in the world. And one thing we were able to do within this project is we were able to map energy use internationally. So these are energy footprints. They take trade into account. We're looking at them internationally, intra-nationally, so income groups within each country across consumption categories. So we also have resolution on products there. So you can see that our paper title was descriptive, our study, and the BBC decided to write it as Climate Change, the Rich Are to Blame, which is true. So this is just the way we did the study. If you're interested, we can go over the methods. But basically, it gives us a lot of resolution. And just to go through some of the main results, we can basically see, for instance, international inequality and categories of energy use. So these plots show Lorentz curves. The red total EF is the total energy footprint. And then you see the different categories. The line of total equality here is this blue line. So the more unequal something is, the more it goes away from this line of total equality. And so what you can see is that energy use is quite unequally distributed worldwide, but that some categories are more equally distributed than the average, which would be food and residential, basically. Energy, whereas some are much more unequally distributed than the average, and those are transport categories. So transport categories, especially things like holidays or airplane, are really, really highly unequally distributed. So in this dark blue one, which is package holidays, effectively long distance travel, long distance holidays, and you can see that, for instance, 10% of the population uses about 75% of the energy globally, which is, or at least in our sample, which is a lot. And what we're also able to do is we're also able to map product categories, which is really important. If you want to change consumption, you'd better understand how that consumption is distributed and who consumes what, for what, why. So in this case, we basically have this 2-quadrant mapping of our product categories. And again, this is really representative of the world, where you have consumed more by rich people on the top, so high elasticity, consumed disproportionately or more than proportionally by poor people below. And to the left, lower energy intensity, so less energy per dollar spent in the economy, to the right, more energy per dollar spent. And obviously, the quadrants we're interested in are the high energy intensity ones. These are the sectors that are causing the most pollution and problems worldwide. And so let's look at what is highly polluting and consumed more by rich people. And you can see, and again, we were actually really surprised to see this. They just really fell out of the data. It's transport categories. So transport as a whole is overwhelmingly, disproportionately consumed by richer people, and the contrary, the thing that's disproportionately consumed or more than proportionally consumed by poor people is heat and electricity, so residential. So you really have this division between transport energy use and residential energy use in buildings. And that means that for your policy, you might want to do something like this. You are not going to grow your way out of rich people using more transport, using more and more energy to fly around the world, to take long distance car travel, heavier and heavier cars, that kind of thing. That consumption is not dematerializing. That consumption is just getting worse and worse. That requires taxation regulation to curb it, right? Whereas the other one, the heat and electricity, the things you need to do for dwellings to decarbonize them, to make them more efficient, you need to do housing retrofit, and you need to decarbonize electricity supply. And that means, but you can't expect the dwelling residents themselves to pay for it because they are disproportionately poor, right? So it means you need public investment in efficiency and low carbon. And if you're clever, maybe you can use your taxation revenue to help fund that investment. That would be a very progressive way of doing it, for instance. Just to reinforce this point that transportation is a really big problem, this plot shows the additional emissions since 2010 and what sector caused them. And you can see that after electricity, the increase in carbon emissions in the last decade comes from heavier than average cars, basically, whereas other cars actually went down in emissions worldwide. It's really impressive. And Tim Gore, who was working at Oxfam when he said this, basically said the same thing as I said in the previous slide. Listen, we really need to have taxes and ban on luxury carbon, and the revenue should be reinvested in public services and low carbon initiatives. If you're interested in more results around inequality, the United Nations Environmental Program Emissions Gap Report came out last year, and it's really good. Quite a bit of our research is represented in there, so I really recommend it if that's something that you're interested in to look in more. I also participated in this paper. Where we basically were trying to collect a lot of this evidence around the disproportionate influence of rich populations and climate change and other environmental damage. And one of the things we really wanted to bring out is that overconsumption is designed in, that this is something that's really it's not just these people, it's really designed in by states, industries, and markets. And so we tried to get into the political economy and the systematic drivers of it. And so hopefully that's something that might be interesting as well. And we also, this is the fun bit, obviously you can't read this, but we tried to talk about the approaches that would allow us to deal with this. And so we have green growth as the sort of mainstream approach on the right, and then there's sort of more reformist approaches that don't care about growth. But then we also had more radical approaches, and a lot of people were pleased that we managed to get Nature to publish something about eco-anarchism and eco-socialism. At least we had fun with it. But I think it's really interesting to think through we're on this crisis moment, or multiple crisis moment rather. What do we do about this? How can we think differently? How much can we open our imagination and do things differently? So hopefully this was helpful. So I'll just talk a little bit about this because it's a fun result. If we make distributions more equal, so we have all this data, we have all these results. Let's just make a model where we know the way the world works. Let's model changing distribution, we can make things more equal and more unequal, right? So let's see what happens. So this is what our model looks like. Basically, you start with an income distribution, you move on to expenditure distribution, you have these different parameters that tell you how the world works, and you end up with final energy footprints. And so we did various versions of this, but basically these different colored lines show you. So the more stretched out this, we kept average GDP per capita the same. The more you stretch out the curve on the left, the more unequal the world is. And by the time you squeeze it to the blue line, it basically means that almost everybody has the same income. So that's sort of a way that we change income distribution. And then the plot on the right shows you how much energy consumption changes globally. And it turns out that if you make the world more unequal, energy use goes down a bit. So in our, an extremely unequal world, you would get your energy use would drop by about 3%. And if you make it super extremely equal, all other things being the same as they say, it increases, but increases by about 7%. So not a huge amount. So basically, that's one of the things we learned, is that redistribution does not actually change energy use that much. And if you think of what you would do, so the thing that does change when you redistribute energy is the thing that changes purpose. Like we just discussed, is what you use the energy for. So in a more equal world, this orange category here, the orange category, which is around heat and electricity in buildings, so dwellings, is the most important. And in a more unequal world, this pink wedge, which is transportation, starts to take over. And by the time you get to a mega consumer, this transportation wedge is really important. The orange bit will, of course, be bigger per person than for the low consumer, but it just tells you the disproportionality. And so what this means, it actually means something quite interesting. It actually means that a more equal world, all other things held the same, would be easier to decarbonize. And I think that was sort of something that people didn't necessarily see that way before, because just because we know that low-income consumers use more energy on buildings, and buildings are easier to decarbonize than transportation. So we can do two things in terms of sustainability. Sustainability requires equality, so we can make the world more equal, and we can also have an easier time decarbonizing it than in a more unequal world. I'm going to skip this part because we don't have time, or whatever. And I'll tell you about some efforts we made to model a different future. So we modeled redistribution, but now we want to model something completely different. And this is based on the Decent Living Energy Framework of Narasimha Rao, who's at Yale. And I really recommend that you look at his work if you're interested in this. He's amazing. So in his Decent Living Energy Framework, he connects human needs to sufficient levels of energy services. So you basically have your human needs and you have your sufficient levels of energy services. So obviously that's very convenient for us. Really fits well with the Living Well Within Limits framework. So we took that and we basically built a global model that takes into account technology improvements, equal distributions, and ends up with lower demand levels. So the model looks like this, roughly. You start at the left. You start with your decent living standards that you sort of translate across into different categories of consumption: personal consumption, public consumption, private consumption, and infrastructure. We're taking into account both direct and embodied energy, because we have a model where we can estimate all of these things. And we also differentiate what the living standards mean depending on, and I don't know if I have that slide. No, I don't. So I'll just tell you, depending on demography. So we have demographics and things like household size and age in there. We have geographic resolution. So if people live in the countryside or in cities, we basically give them different mobility requirements. And we also change depending on climate, and we actually have some warming in the model, or we change the warming in the model. So basically say you need more heating or more cooling depending on the climate that you're in. So all of that stuff is thrown in. And the result is that we don't need that much energy if that's the way we want to run the world. So here the results are shown compared to other references. So in this plot on the left, we have the global final energy use, so historic, and then the International Energy Agency, that's the IEA, their reference scenario, which just keeps on growing, 2-degree scenario, which sort of stabilizes, and their beyond or below 2-degree scenario, which goes down a tiny bit. The blue dot here, the blue arrow here, is the low energy demand scenario of Arnold Grubler and company, and that's around 250 exajoules. And our model is the little green one. So it's really quite low. I mean, it's obviously very ambitious, but it's also not, we've put a lot of resolution in there. There's quite a lot, we've put a lot of, in some ways there's realism as well, right? Because we are talking about everything that somebody might need. So basically, in our conclusion is that decent living energy for all is achievable at 40% of current energy use, despite population growth for the year 2050. So that's good, I guess. A good life for all within planetary limits might be technically possible. So this is the interesting part, right? So trying to get to this part of the talk. If it's possible, what is standing in our way? And that was something that I really wanted to include in the project, was why we know that redistribution is possible in a lot of different sectors. We know that things could be run very differently. Why are things the way they are? And this has to do with this middle part of our framework, which is the provisioning systems. So what we did is we basically used the systems of provision approach to look at the political economy of car dependence. So this is completely different. It's not a quantitative study. It's a qualitative study. It's using methods from heterodox economics. We're looking at this provisioning system of car dependence because what we decided, looking at the transport sector, is that we decided that that the main product is less the car and more the reliance on the car. And we wanted to understand how that was created over time. So it's really a historical study in a certain sense. We're looking at the creation and evolution of car dependence. And this was led by Giulio Mattioli, who's an extraordinary researcher. So that the whole team was really great. And I remember at the very first meeting he came in, he said, we need to look at least 5 aspects if we want to get this right. And we were able to do, I think, a decent job on all 5 of them. So the automotive industry, car infrastructure, so roads and parking, land use for car, which is things like urban planning, zoning laws, neglect for public transportation, and car culture. And I just want to show you a little bit what this means, because I think it makes this idea of green growth and degrowth for the purposes of our seminar as well a little bit. It gives it a little bit more realism in a certain sense, or a little bit more concrete. So here we're looking at the automotive industry from an integrated socioeconomic and technical perspective. And I said at the beginning, this is really important for us to be able to study social and physical aspects of these things together. And for instance, the automotive industry has a huge scale and economic significance, which means that for car dependence, it has a lot of political clout. There's a huge capital intensity and large economies of scale. And that is partly because of the design. The physical design of car is a single chassis design. And that means that they need massive factories in order to make the whole car. And that means that they have high financial commitments because they have to repay that capital. And it also means that and that also gives them a lot of political clout because they're at that location where they have that factory. That factory is the main game in town. So that means that they have politicians. Whoever is elected from that region will be basically an actor that is in favor of the automotive industry very, very strongly, even though the total amount of employment on the scale of the whole country is probably comparable to public transportation. They will have much stronger political strength because of their concentrated location. So the geography of it matters. These factories are have endemic overcapacity and overproduction. So a car factory cannot degrow. If they go below something like, I don't know, 90 or 85% of their capacity, they might as well shut down because that's how large their losses are. So they're really stuck. They're really stuck in terms of their in terms of their production scale. So every time there's an economic crisis, it's an existential crisis. For an economic downturn is an existential crisis for the automotive industry, which is why they immediately go to their political friends and say, you have to get us out of here. So all these economic recovery packages that focus on the automotive industry, that's one of the reasons why it is an industry that can't slow down. And they constantly need to be creating markets and mechanisms for overconsumption. Another example when we looked at road building, one of the things we found that was really fascinating about road building is how extraordinarily like a chameleon and opportunistic this industry is. So in terms of their lobbying, I've never seen anything like it. It's only when you see the whole thing together that you really get it. So they have all these different strategies. No matter what the question, no matter who you are, no matter what the question, no matter the time you live in, the answer is always build more roads. So in economic terms, if there's they appeal to growth. So if you're in time of growth, road building is necessary to accommodate growth. Okay. If you're in an economic downturn and crisis, immediately they become Keynesians, right? They're like, road building is required to stimulate economic growth. So it doesn't matter what your economic situation is, the answer is road building. Appeal to popular consumerism, which appeals to the political right. Car infrastructure is required by consumer preferences. Okay, so that's very important. They immediately have a very strong argument with right-wing politicians. But there's also a very strong appeal to the political left because road building is a means to regional development and social inclusion. So that's the argument where you want to convince, when you want to convince your left-wing politician. And they're also the answer to their own problems. So when you build roads, you have this induced motorization. So every time you build a road, you cause more traffic. So the answer is always more road building, even though road building is also the problem as well. And they also present themselves as apolitical and technocratic. So you're really up against this industry where no matter what the problem is, building more roads is your solution. And sort of as we went through this whole thing, and if you're more interested, please have a look at the article, we really were able to sort of look at these interconnections and understand that we're really looking, when we look at our economic systems, we're looking at an political economy of carbon lock-in, so that we really have all of these different factors reinforcing each other. And if you want to break out of it, you have to consider all of them together. And I don't expect you to read this. It's just to sort of say that we really tried to systematically understand the cause and effect across these different sectors. I'm just going to finish. So that was really sort of an overview of what we've done within, of a lot of the things we've done within Living Well Within Limits project. I would not, I really think it's important that we change the way we do research and the way we interact socially. So I think that we really have a strong, there's a strong case to be made that academics should get out of buildings and get out of just normal writing papers, and that we really need to be part of changing the world. So our research, our understanding of the situation we are in does not allow for gradual transitions, but calls for radical transformation. And the popular movements get this. So already academia has been, passed widely by the student strike movements, the Sunrise Movement, the Extinction Rebellion, etc. And one of my questions is, okay, so whose side are we on? Is our research supporting them? How can we contribute and participate? And that's a question I think is very important. I agree completely with Charlie Gardner and Claire Worldly, who said that the science, who had wrote this great article already a couple of years ago, the scientists who alerted the world to climate and ecological crises have a moral duty to join the popular movements demanding political action. I subscribe to that 100%. I think I would go even further. I think anybody who understands the climate and ecological crises has a moral duty to join these actions. And hopefully that is a good start for discussion. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry if I went a bit fast. I wanted to get to the question part. So I hope that was at least understandable.
No, that was very clear. Thank you. I have no doubt that will generate plenty of discussion. Okay, so just to frame this, let's see. The rules are, if you would like to ask a question, please put, you can write hand in the chat. It would also not be a bad idea if we have a fair number of people in the chat today, and some of them I don't know. If you could maybe just say your discipline or the background you're coming from, it would just kind of clarify a little bit, and we can maybe try to balance different points of view. But there's already some people with hands in the chat. Most of you probably know this procedure, but if you want to follow up specifically on a previous question and you think the momentum will be lost if you put yourself at the end of the list, you can also write finger, which means that you get to sort of jump to the head of the queue to kind of follow up on the immediate topic of conversation. Kim has just demonstrated perfectly how this is going to work. She has given us her disciplinary background. So thank you for modeling that procedure. As I said before, be aware that we're still recording, and we will be for 30 minutes. After that, we will no longer be recording, and we have an hour up to an hour for Q&A. Okay, so I believe, let's see, Krister and then Gustav and Kim will go in that order. So Krister, please begin.
Well, thank you so much. Very interesting talk. I just want to comment on the well-being. I'm a philosopher and I've been working on.
I hear a bad sound from Krister.
Oh.
Is it good for everybody else?
No, we get an echo.
It's an echo, yeah. Is it gone now?
No, it's gone.
Okay, good. Okay, I'll try again. Hi, I'm a philosopher and I work a bit on well-being. Really enjoyed your talk. Just a question actually about the well-being setup, because I didn't sort of recognize Epicurus as I know him. I think he's actually on your side. It's true that he's called a hedonist, but there's a misunderstanding about what that hedonism involved. He was actually proposing something that goes really into your own sort of a team, namely that we shouldn't consume. We should really put a lid on consumption, and we should work towards tranquility and the absence of suffering. So a little bit like actually some Buddhist ideas, in fact. So he was very much against consumption of material goods. So I think you should put him in your team. And also I think you should put a lot of happiness researchers, which you mentioned was on the other side, in your own team. Because in fact, the measure you use, the life satisfaction measure, is actually developed by a lot of happiness researchers. And they really should be part of your team. And you can then see that it's a good idea, right, to show that if you go for human needs as being the sort of intrinsic final goods, or if you go for life satisfaction or happiness as the final good for humans, doesn't matter. You know, this approach shows that they come together, right? And they are all in your team. So I suggest you invite more people to your team.
Thanks, Krister. And obviously, it's extremely embarrassing to give that level of presentation in front of an audience of somebody who might actually know about it. So you're exactly right to pick up on the fact that this is very much a cartoon version. And I understand that Epicure is more subtle. And that's also why it's interesting to go back and look at these things. I mean, because Aristotle is also more subtle. I mean, we can get into that, but you know, Aristotle has like his definition of well-being like 3 or 4 pages after he goes into great detail as to why slavery is really important to the good life. There's a lot to unpack there, So I think you're right that Epicure is more subtle. However, what he's become, if you sort of trace this lineage there is that lineage all the way through, you know, John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham. So the utilitarians, they do try to go back to that in some ways. So it's more what he's become, I guess, is the cartoon version. And maybe I should make that clear. I do think that this idea of this sort of Buddhist tranquility is not something that I would associate with social well-being, in the sense that we can't wait for everybody to join a monastery, become enlightened. So my view is this social perspective. Well-being is what we create for each other, regardless of whether or not somebody aspires to tranquility or not. It's just something that we have to strive for it for everybody, not just for the enlightened few. In terms of, so that would be one distinction I would at least keep in mind. In terms of the happiness versus life satisfaction. Life satisfaction is a very funny indicator because you're right. It includes the sort of happiness perspective, but if you look, it encompasses both. Because when you ask people how satisfied are you about your life, they're not looking just at their current or recent emotional state. They're looking at sort of how their life went. And a lot of that is underpinned by the social support they've received during their life, which rejoins our human need provision perspective. So that's why we sort of say life satisfaction can't be categorized so easily. I understand it's subjective, but I don't ascribe to the idea that subjective is hedonic and objective is eudaimonic. I think that that was one of the things we tried to clarify in the article with Lina Brandt-Correa's. The method is separate from the theory. You can assess hedonic well-being objectively or subjectively, or you can assess eudaimonic well-being objectively or subjectively, but life satisfaction crosses both categories. So that's just what it is. In terms of happiness research, I think a lot of it is quite interesting. One of the things that it doesn't help us with so much is strategies for climate mitigation or whatever. The problem with happiness research, I mean, I'm just going to say it, and I guess might not make some friends or whatever, is that because the pure happiness people, not necessarily the epicure people like you're talking about, is that because they're so focused on sort of ephemeral or instantaneous emotional states, that they don't see people as having political or citizenship agency. So their approach to climate change is like, well, think happy thoughts as the world burns. Like that is literally, it's like adaptive happiness, it's an adaptive sort of responsive, become emotionally attuned to these things as opposed to like, no, you can actually intervene in the system. So that's one of the reasons why I think that I would not necessarily be friends with quite a bit of happiness research based on that perspective. But also because it's good to keep academic fights going. We all know this.
Okay, just a short reply. So I wasn't suggesting that Epicurus has the right view about everything. I was just saying that Epicureans can go along with your proposal because they can realize that if they satisfy these human needs you actually are listing, they will reach tranquility and the absence of suffering. That might be one part of actually what's valuable right? Not the only part. And also I think if it's the worry about being sort of isolated individuals and perhaps elitism, then Aristotle should go because he's an elitist, right? So for him, the highest good is actually understanding theoria, right? Which only few people can reach. So he's not really a good role model if you want to go for anti-elitism. And the happiness research, I think a lot of happiness research I've talked to, they really actually do believe that well-being is about taking a certain attitude, having a certain emotion, not just towards the present moment, but towards domains of your life, the future, the past, and so on, right? So they subscribe to a much more holistic view about the sort of emotional, the relevance for emotions, right? Which I think is in line with what you're saying. So again, perhaps not the whole truth about what's good for people, but a relevant part of it. And as you can see that they correlate with your human needs satisfaction, and just welcome them, invite them.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks for being the advocate of more inclusivity. That's good. Thanks, Christer.
Gustav has a finger on that topic.
Yeah, I turned my hand into a finger because Christer so elegantly explained the same reaction I had. I felt a little bit that putting Epicurus as somebody in favor of overconsumption would be like saying that Karl Marx was in favor of some kind of neoliberal capitalism. But just to add a little bit on that, let me just have a little bit of fun also. There's a famous quote from Epicurus, which you might actually disagree with, but it just shows what a kind of philosophy he was. He said that a small single good piece of cheese could be equally pleasing as a big, big feast. And he was very much against that you should get happiness by having drinking and eating a lot. So he was very, very modest. But in your answer to to Krista, you said that, oh yeah, but then Bentham and Mill, they got into this. But that's not true either. Bentham already in that time was very clear on the fact that this idea of diminishing marginal utility of money. So for that reason, said that happiness that will be reached by having more equality and getting your basic needs and things like that. That's right. And Mill went even further because he made a distinction between higher goods and lower goods. And lower goods was this kind of overconsumption and consumption. Higher goods, was reading poetry and things like that. So there is rather, I would say, or really say, as Chris said, I think it's easier to get the hedonist on your side than to get Aristotle on your side. And especially because so many people coming out from Aristotle, they go for what is called an objective list. That means that certain things are good for you to have, irrespective if you get happy from it or not. And that can lend itself to misuse that you should have this kind of material goods, even if it doesn't make your life better.
Yeah, I guess. Thanks, Gustav. And I think that this is obviously we're getting down all kinds of rabbit holes here. I think that your point on Bentham and Mill, I'm not saying that they didn't have a conceptualization around consumption. For instance, Mill, had this idea of he didn't call it a steady state economy, but he saw the ultimate point of the economy as a stabilization, not as endless growth, for instance. So it's very clear that they had ideas around consumption and economics that were not necessarily infinite growth. But this idea of higher or lower, I would actually flip it on its head. People need the lower stuff, and then they have a chance at life, right? So there is again this idea of this kind of elitist idea around the higher form of life will aspire to sort of more spiritual and tranquil and whatever things, and all we need to do is get there. If the way our society translates that is economic growth, and people just buy SUVs and fly around the world all the time. So
that I would say is a kind of still like a caricature of him. Of course, he would agree that you need the basic things first, food and things like that. But then he said you can get, if you can say, the trade-offs then later on by having more kind of this TV or having some more intellectual experience. And that can of course be seen as elitist, but it can equally be seen that the importance of access to education for everybody.
So, and I guess maybe I think it's just a really interesting discussion, and I'm actually gaining a lot from it. But just to defend Aristotle a little bit, even though he was elitist schmuck and in favor of slavery and thought that women should stay in the kitchen.
I didn't bring that part up.
Well, Aristotle needs defending, but I think that one of the things I would defend about Aristotle is his idea. Is his idea that the meaningful life, a good life, is a social one. So it's not one of contemplation. It's one of involvement. And I think that that's one of the things that we need to be aiming for in whatever we're building. So I subscribe, for instance, one of the people I haven't mentioned, but who's very important to me and to our project and our research is Manfred Max Neef, who has this idea of human well-being being needs, and a list of them. But then they can be satisfied in different ways. And he has these, I forget what he calls them. I'm bad at remembering terms, but I think he calls them existential categories or whatever. They're basically strategies for satisfying human needs. We have being, having, doing, and interacting. And I think maybe if I understand you correctly, epicure might be around the being, where you sort of, or the happiness, you have a sort of state of mind. Having is obviously consuming in some ways. But doing and interacting is where we need to go. We need to be able to build these sort of much more interactive, much more engaged societies where we don't leave decision-making to the markets, where we don't let a company like Exxon decide that to turn our planet into something where we have a very, very hard time to live. So I think that that's also something where Aristotle's view on a good life being a life of engagement in one's society and honors for him, like the highest status is as actually when you're given responsibilities. And I think that that's quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, not quite close. I think going along Chris's suggestion, I think actually that any of the leading moral theories of well-being, be it hedonist or desire-based or objective, can get on your side. So you don't need to take a stance. You can say, look, if you look at all this modern research, this is what we need to do. So you don't need to say that I don't think there is a surviving conflict. That last word.
Okay, I'm calling time on the heavy philosophy discussions in the ancient Greeks.
Thank you.
I'm handing the conch over to Kim from a sustainability science perspective, please, Kim.
Thank you, Malcolm. Hi, Julia. I have an armchair philosophy question, even though I am a sustainability scientist. But I don't know anything about Epicurus or Aristotle, so don't worry, I will not question that. I would love to hear, well, first, I don't think I praised your talk enough. It was an excellent talk, and I've long cited and taught your work, actually, but it was very interesting to hear it as a coherent whole, and I learned a lot of new things, so thank you for that. I have two questions. The first is, at the end, you conclude we need radical transformations to sustainability, and I'm certainly not going to dispute that. But I would love to hear you articulate from what and to what, in how do you envision that? And then my second question is, basically, who needs to do what to make the world more equal? In particular, how do we get the rich, which I understand includes myself and many, if not all of us on this call, to accept and strive after sufficiency?
Okay, so I think we'll just take them. Thanks, Kim, and it's very nice to be in a virtual room with you. One of these days we will be able to get around Europe by train again, and then I will make my way up to Sweden and we will hang out, and it'll be very nice. But in the meantime, so radical transformation from and to, I think that question's a bit hard to answer actually without knowing a bit more about what you consider, because you could answer that question along any dimension of our current existence in terms of there's your second question is basically how do we do it for equity, but you could think about it for each sector of the economy, whether it's buildings or transportation or food, agriculture, trade, mobility, like everything, right? You could think about it in terms of consumption. You could think about it in terms of personal life. You could think about it in terms of industrial strategy. You could think about it in terms of government, financing. You could think about it in terms of our economic systems. So everything's going to have to change. And what's interesting is to think about it maybe from a systemic perspective in terms of, or more importantly, from a political economy perspective, what are the systems and processes that will allow us to navigate a change into the unknown? So everybody likes to model. Everybody likes mainstream economics because it has a model. The fact that the model is wrong and leads to disaster is really secondary to the fact that it's comforting to have a model at all. And also that model specifically is comforting to people in power and wealthy people. To be completely honest, that's how mainstream economics has stayed in business. But so we're venturing into the unknown, and maybe one of the most important things here is to have to bring along principles. So maybe we're going back into the philosophy discussion in the sense of when you don't know what you're doing, you need to have mechanisms for correction. You need to know not to mess up as you go forward. You need to be open to new ideas, to feedback, to answers. So you need to have a very sort of wide range of ways you think that things could be organized differently and be open to debate. And one of the things I think is very important here is actually democracy, concepts around democracy, citizens' assemblies, economic democracy. So if you ask me, one of the core things I think needs to change is we need to move away from specialization in our work and our lives. That we need to be able to be broader, because the only way we're going to get this intelligence that allows us to navigate through is not to be like, oh, I'm the expert on this, and the whole rest of the world I conceptualize in this sort of idealized, reified, totally wrong way. And that means that even though I'm an expert, I'm still giving wrong advice. So maybe my job is, let's say my job is a school teacher. Then I go into school and I teach, but I will also have other functions. I'll be on the local energy board or on the local water board. So I think that is really important so one of the things, a result I didn't show you, it's not published yet, but we're seeing it across a range of things. One of the most important things to allow people to live good lives at low resource use, we can see it happen when people have good public services. So public shared services are essential, but that requires citizen engagement. It requires citizen protection. So I think everybody should be having this role, not just as an elected politician or something, but engaged in that public service delivery, in how it's decarbonized, how it's made more sustainable, that kind of stuff. So I think we need ranges of roles. We need to be, that's part of what this doing and interacting means. So I think that that's probably one element of transformation that's pretty radical compared to where we are now. So, and my lesson from the citizens' assemblies is communication, education, and citizen engagement are transformative. They really change the way people see the world and what they want to do. And they change people's lives. I mean, people come into that because they got a letter in the mail, and maybe they were a climate denier before, maybe they just didn't care, and they leave it thinking, okay, this is part of my work from now on. You know, they don't. That's something that it happens to everybody, not just academics. So I think that's really powerful. In terms of equality, so how do we convince the rich? I think we need political movements. I don't think that people give up anything based on personal virtue or being personally convinced or anything like that. So I think we need political movements around equality. I think we need wealth taxes. I think we need, again, this work of educating people about where economic growth really goes, which is to the wealthy, around the fact that inequality has been growing to obscene levels, maybe less in Sweden than elsewhere, but it's really bad. So I think it's a power struggle. So the rich are the powerful, and they're not going to give up anything without that counterpower. So it's a question of building that counterpower. It's not going to make life worse for anybody, but it just can't. I don't think that wealth inequality is compatible with a sustainable future. Not at the levels that we have now, for sure.
Thank you so much.
Kim, did you want to follow up on anything, or?
Over a beer after a train trip through Europe, definitely, but nothing more that has to be discussed right now. Thank you. Thank you, Julia.
Okay, all philosophers would agree on that agenda. Okay, so we had a question from the chat from Arnold Bomans, who is a amateur scientist from Extinction Rebellion and the Dutch Footprint Group. And he asked a question about renewable energies. And I'm going to sort of paraphrase it, Julia, and maybe you could just say something about your optimism about the prospects for renewable energies with, let's say, big questions about biomass and nuclear and how we think about those in the course of getting to net zero emissions, by 2050 or whatever target date you sort of want to think about. And a related point, maybe you could actually just elaborate a little bit on, you went very quickly through some of the modeling about levels of energy that would sort of satisfy the donut, basically. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe say a bit more about that in relation to the question of renewable energy. And also, if this is not asking too much, how that relates to population.
Okay.
And how about 2025 going net zero? Sounds impossible, but I'm interested in the energy balance, if you know anything about it.
So I guess what I have to say is that I don't have a comprehensive picture, because within our project we were able to do some things, but it's always like in order to be able to do research, you have to like zoom in on a part of the thing. Like you're looking at those two things and you understand those two things. And so we don't have a comprehensive picture yet. And obviously it would be nice if we had been able to do this research sooner. I've been wanting to do it for years, but couldn't get funding because nobody would take it seriously. So that's fun. But one of the problems that we have with the current models is that, except for the low energy demand model, which only came out in 2018, none of them really take demand reduction seriously. So if you want, net zero by any time soon, to be honest, you need to look at demand reductions and really serious ones. And then and I think that that's really important for renewable energy as well. So I'm not a specialist of the energy supply side. I really look at demand, which when I was starting to do this research, I sort of looked around at what was being done, and I decided that demand was really under research, which is true. It's just criminal. So we have a whole bunch of people doing supply side modeling, cost benefit, blah, 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 deployment, interrelations, smart grids, what have you, storage. A huge amount of people doing that, very, very, very little on demand. So that's why I focused on demand. So I'm not completely qualified to speak on the supply side. I do know one thing. It is a lot easier to ramp up to supply a lower level of energy demand for renewable energy. It's much easier to supply half of what we use now than twice what we use now, right? That's pretty clear. So I think that that's something I really don't see. I think that the demand reduction agenda and the renewable supply agenda are really very closely aligned. It's not, because some people were mad at me when we published some of these articles. They were like, it's all going to be supplied by renewables anyway. Why do you care? You're being useless. And it's like, no, it's not. We're not ramping up renewables fast enough. We're really struggling against the clock here because of fossil fuel subsidies, because the technologies weren't completely ready, because of regulatory issues, because of lots of things. So we need to ramp up renewables like crazy. But right now, it's still only, it's still something like under 20% of total final energy supply globally. So, individual countries are different, obviously. So we're going to struggle to, if we double that, that's great. Then we can get to about 40%, which is, I think, where we can be if we reduce energy demand. So I think we really need to have both strategies. And I'm sorry if that's not a very helpful answer. There was something about
Thank you.
You had something on population, Malcolm?
Yeah, I was just wondering, you talked about the modeling of essentially what, as I understand it, what's a level of energy demand that would allow essentially for a good life for everyone, and on the other hand, essentially reach sort of sustainable levels. And so I think of that as sort of the Raworth donut zone, if I understood kind of how you're thinking about it.
Yeah.
I guess I was just wondering, is there a sort of parameter for population in there that matters to any significant degree?
All right. So I think that that's actually a really interesting question. And it's very often the third rail of like environmental or sustainability studies because of its honestly pretty nasty history. So The Population Bomb was not a very nice book. And also, anyway, so, but I think it's worth thinking and talking about. So right now, population is not the main driver. So the things that are the main drivers are inequality and overconsumption. So if we go back to I can just go back to this plot, which really summarizes it, of the United Nations emissions gap report, which shows that I think the lowest 50% of the population in the world only emit 7% of greenhouse gases. So in that sense, people who live in conditions of extreme poverty and deprivation, that population can grow as much as it wants and it's not going to have an environmental impact. However, they're living in misery. So that's obviously not very pleasant. So yeah, it's more of a right now the impacts are very much being driven by overconsumption. The top 10% are responsible for 50% of emissions, the bottom 10% responsible for less than 10. So in that sense, you can't say that population is the driver in our current system. However, if we move towards more equity and more sufficiency, then population becomes a factor, right? So if we say, listen, nobody gets left behind, everybody has the right to a certain material, like these decent living standards that we've been talking about, then population becomes a factor because you're taking economic inequality out of it. And then it becomes very interesting because it's like, what is sustainable? It depends how it's supplied. So if we say everybody needs around, 15 gigajoules per capita, well, you could supply those gigajoules in a sustainable way or an unsustainable way. So then the production side of that need satisfaction becomes important. If everybody needs a certain number of calories, you could produce that in a more or less sustainable way. So then your production systems become the determining factor. So maybe that was a bit of a complicated answer, but I think population becomes important when we make poverty and deprivation unacceptable.
No, I asked the question. I think you'd find much of this audience would agree with you about all of that. I think it's not that we're a very population-focused group of people when it comes to thinking about ways to deal with climate change, but it it's in the air a lot, and so I think we want to address it. And it's also the case that for the broader program of which, this workshop and therefore your seminar is a part, the philosophers could tell you more about this, but population ethics is a big focus. And so I just wanted to get that on the table. We have a finger on this topic, I guess, from Daniel. Did you want to get in on this topic?
And this is a question just like from a theoretical perspective, not that I think it's the most important thing, but I can always see clearly how overconsumption and affluence are directly causing environmental impact. But when people start these discussions with inequality causing it, it almost seems to me that when the explanation is delivered, it's not really inequality per se. It's just it's the fact that a lot of people are consuming a lot. So if there's really inequality causing it, could you give examples of what are the mechanisms through which this happens?
Yeah, I think inequality. So probably I'm starting to be tired, so my answer is probably not going to be as clear as it could be. That's my excuse. Actually, so if you look in our paper on scientists running to affluence, we try to go into that a bit, if I recall correctly. But one of the ways that inequality is not just because you're right, you could say inequality. You're not talking about inequality being a causal factor. It's just sort of the baseline factor that, and then the thing that's causing it is overconsumption of the richest, right? But inequality is not causing it per se. But actually, inequality can be considered a causal factor as well. It sort of depends on your interpretation. If you think of the types of consumption in an unequal society, especially a neoliberal market-based one, which is a lot of where we live right now, because since the 1980s, I've been living in the UK, in the US, even Switzerland now. These societies are very much run like that. You get inefficiencies. So you get very much inefficiencies because everybody is the ideology of this unequal society that glorifies inequality is that everybody has to provision their own needs through the market. And that's super inefficient. There's just no other way around it. That's why healthcare takes up, whatever it is, like 20% of US GDP or something. I forget, I'm going to get that number's wrong, but it's just hugely expensive for very little delivery, is because everybody is thrown on their own devices. Same for across the board, same for education, same for transportation, same for everything. So the car-centric transportation system is an example of that. Every individual is supposed to supply their own mobility, right? And so unequal societies have this sort of built-in inefficiency, also because very unequal societies are actually violent in a certain way. Like you could call it social violence. I mean, thanks to COVID, we now have the concept of social murder that came out in the UK, where that rich people have to sort of separate themselves and protect themselves from the rest of society. So you get these like gated communities, these enclaves, and that's again a source of inefficiency, right? And it's a source of inefficiency in governance because, for instance, again, I'm going to take examples from the UK because I just came from there and it's a hellscape. But you're governed by people who do not know what it's like to go to a normal school. You are governed by people who have never been on a bus. They just have no relationship to your life. And that's a source that I would say that's a cause of unsustainability and inefficiency in the way we run our societies materially as well, because they just don't know how to provide things for the rest of us in a reasonable way. And I think that if you look at a more equal society, you would have you could imagine something like universal basic services, which I think is a great idea from Anna Kut. And that all of a sudden, everybody gets broadband. You don't have to have these communities in rural England that are digging the trenches through their own fields to get optical fiber, to their village. You can do it much better. So I think I do think that there are causal mechanisms as well at play, in that have to do probably more with the political economy, the geography, and how inequality translates itself through these provisioning systems, basically, to make things more unsustainable.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for the question, Daniel. Julia, if you do get too exhausted or your son needs attention or whatever, feel free to let us know. But otherwise, I think we can probably keep peppering you with questions for some time. I have Karim next on the queue, and deep breath, we're going back to philosophy.
Thanks. Thanks for a great talk. a lot of interesting ideas to think about. So I would like to connect to Kimberly's question, and I would like to know if you have any kind of ideas or suggestions for concrete policy reforms that would lead to degrowth. I think you mentioned the demand reduction. Did you mean like taxes on energy? But because I was thinking that if that money that you take in taxes would be used for social spending, either on green infrastructure or transfers to the poor, that might not lead to degrowth. I mean, because then it's like the same amount of money that's circling around. And likewise, wealth taxes that you also mentioned, that could also lead to increased growth if the money is transferred to the poor. Because, rich people save money to a greater extent than the poor. So at least in some countries, greater equality could lead to more growth.
And there are a lot of countries where growth is absolutely necessary, right? Because you're looking at, even if you look at the national average. So Karim's question, I was going to remember it. Concrete policies for degrowth and whether or not these would result in growth or not. So to be honest, I don't care. My perspective is very clear, which is I have social and environmental goals. Those are, I'm very much a donutist or a Kate Rayworthist. So those are the priorities. And as long as those two are fine, I don't actually care what the economy, if GDP goes up or down is completely irrelevant to me. So that's one answer. I think that a lot of the policies are in fact quite Keynesian. And as you said, that they sort of would stimulate the economy. We're talking about retrofitting or doing something to every single last building on Earth, and building new strong buildings for people who don't have good living conditions right now. That's an employment proposition, right? And same for public transportation, same for change. So across the board, a lot of this will be poverty alleviation and employment. The next generation of models we want to build will integrate some of this. So we're really looking forward to having this more comprehensive view and this more sectoral view. And again, the sad thing is that current energy or climate models don't do this. They don't care about employment. Don't ask me why. I didn't build them. But it's a bit sad. So we're just going to try to throw something together and see what we can come up with. But I think that's if anybody else wants to do it, please do, because it's a really open area. So I think that those idea of industrial policies that would change things would be quite interesting. There's another side to it, though, which is still sort of the degrowth side. And there's tons of stuff that's been written on degrowth policies. If you want a specific book, so around work time reduction, around redistribution, around whatever, Enough is Enough by Dan O'Neill is sort of basically goes through some of the main degrowth or steady state policies, which I think are quite interesting to think about. There is still an aspect where growth is problematic. So the reason that growth is problematic is not because of growth itself, it's because of who it serves. And the reason that we have growth is because it's a stable, the caricature is basically that it's a stabilization mechanism of capitalism. And capitalism is crisis prone without growth. So if we want to get to a state where we can focus on our objectives, which are social and environmental, we need to take that growth imperative out of the system. So we need to have an economy that is allowed not to care whether or not it grows or degrows, where our core systems, be it pension funds, our banking systems, our monetary systems, our government finances are protected against this thing going up and down. And that requires degrowth policies. But that also requires a confrontation or a struggle that involves the people who are currently powerful, the institutions currently powerful. Thinking in Switzerland, I know exactly who these institutions are. It requires a confrontation with them in order to get to the point where we can embark on this adventure to see what's possible. Or we have to do both at the same time. Can't wait one for the other.
Can I have a short follow-up? It seems to me that was a really interesting answer. It was not what I expected, actually. It seems to me that the difference between the position that you're taking and the green growth position, it's that they're not that different, it seems to me. I mean, where I mean, because I think that many people who advocate green growth, they say that growth is fine as long as it's possible to combine with climate goals. And it not that growth is kind of intrinsically valuable. And it seems like you're saying maybe it's kind of similar to that position, where you're saying that, I'm fine with growth as long as we achieve zero by a certain date.
Yeah.
Am I correct? Is that correct interpretation?
That's correct. I think that the political economy questions are central. The question is whose system are we supporting or comforting? I don't think one of the reasons I'm considering myself to be on the degrowth side, despite the fact that I actually don't care. I mean, what GDP does, honestly, who cares? But is because of this political economy question. Is as soon as you say we're going to have a green growth strategy, you're leaving the current power system intact, and that power system is antithetical to making progress. That's my view. But I think you're absolutely right that there's a lot of commonality on strategy, a lot of commonality on goals, a lot of commonality on specific policies as well. And that's why I thought that this thing that I'm just going to link in the chat, which is a piece that was written by Beth, the great and the amazing Beth Stratford, is really good, because she's basically like, listen, if we stopped fighting for a second, maybe we could make progress together on these common elements of agenda, which are exactly the kinds of things that you were pointing out. We actually have a lot in common in terms of what we want to achieve. Maybe we need to work on those things together while we still discuss these other elements and what's possible or not, and how we think about it. And I mean, academic disputes are fun, but it's maybe not the most important thing right now.
Thanks.
I mean, there isn't another hand in the chat, so I didn't really end up asking my question when I had myself in the queue earlier. I'm a little unsure then. So on the one hand, you announced at the start that you were definitely not a green growth person, but now you seem to be sort of deconstructing the dichotomy of green growth and degrowth. And I'm not really sure how we got from one point to the next in an hour and a half.
So the reason I consider myself to be a degrowth person rather than a green growth person is because, in my view, I guess because I'm translating them into my terms. I looked for green growth. So I was one of the people, I started looking at resource use and energy use and emissions, and I was looking for it in the data and couldn't find, convinced myself in 2012 that it wasn't there, and moved on. And I guess my caricature of green growth, or the way I'm translating it is green growth is a strategy that allows the current economic system we're basically accommodating sustainability changes within the current economic system. And my view of that is that the current economic system that values GDP, where growth accrues to the wealthy, where we leave our industrial structures untouched, where we basically keep on with the same politics, the same management, that kind of thing, is not going to cut it. So I guess what I'm translating green growth is what is the institutions and ways of functioning that growth currently protects. And I do not think that transformation, the kind of transformation we need to be safe, is compatible with those systems. Now, once we get away from them, once we protect ourselves from them, at that point we're in a very different world. Where I guess it's not about the GDP metric. And we wrote a paper called Roots, Riots, and Radical Change a couple of years ago. So Elke Pirkmeijer is the first author on that, where we basically accused everybody of having a growth fetish. Like, everybody has this GDP fetish. Like, we like to talk about this one metric. Even when we're against it, we just focus on that one thing. And that's not the point. The point is, who is running the market? Who is running the economy? To what purpose? And in that sense, I am very much on the side of being a Marxian political economist. I don't know if you can tell that I'm trying to grow my long gray beard, but and thank God there are no real. You think philosophers are bad? Wait until you find Marxian scholars. Like, they are scary. They're terrifying.
Hey, I'm a sociologist. I know the species.
Oh, they're scary, but I agree with them in the sense that, and I certainly find myself on that side in the sense that it's the underlying that we are in an economy that's a reflection of social relations, that the economy is not a law to itself. Economics does not reflect natural market laws. Like, that stuff is just, from a physicist perspective, not only am I insulted, but it's just wrong, right? It's just complete nonsense. So we are in an economic system that is socially created, that reflects existing social relations and power structures. And the current growth paradigm is a comfort blanket around that power system, which includes the automotive industry, it includes ExxonMobil, it includes all of these people. And so green growth, to my mind, does not address the root cause. Whereas degrowth basically says, listen, it rips the comfort blanket off and it says, we're going for you guys. So that's my perspective.
So Gustav has a finger on that comment, but I'm going to just follow up on my own, which is, I mean, to be honest, the way you presented it just now, it seems like the biggest distinction is that degrowth people have not just a sustainability kind of, aren't just prioritizing sustainability, but they're prioritizing social justice also for its own sake. And that's maybe the crucial distinction. But that's relevant because it's not an environmental goal. It sounds like it's a social justice goal or a flattening of power in society goal, maybe is a better way to put it, or something, an equalization of power goal, which is fine. I'm actually on side with that political agenda as well, but that doesn't seem to me intrinsically related to growth or the environment.
I can't speak to all degrowthers. I'm speaking for myself here. So I think quite a lot of the degrowth community basically sees, the correlation between GDP and environmental damage, doesn't see a way out from under that empirically, and says, listen, we need to be in a system that allows GDP to go down, or that needs to be possible, and think about ways to do that. I think the political economy or the social justice aspect is probably stronger with me than with others, although it certainly can be there. So I don't want to speak for everybody here.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. Okay, I'll give over to Gustav on this point.
Thank you. I think you and Malcolm were getting into something really interesting here, although I don't think it's necessary to grow a Karl Marx beard to get into that. And this is more like a question out of curiosity, or it might be useful. I mean, in kind of philosophy, political philosophy and things like that, where perhaps Marx is not such a big figure as in sociology or other places, there are like an interest in how to change the basic structure of the economy so it would be more environmentally friendly. And there is very much investigated into the problem of having this kind of stock-owned company, limited companies that have, as often in the law, that they have to maximize profit. And what one have looked into is rather, cooperatives, or to put it in a different way, more correct way, employer-owned companies. And empirical studies there show that they tend to, in many cases, or generally, they tend to be much more environmentally friendly. It doesn't solve all problems, but they don't have the same growth impetus as stock-owned companies, since you're replacing salaries with sharing of the profit, and therefore you don't employ more people just every time it increases the profit. It has to increase the average profit. And similar thing, they're also more rooted usually in the local community. So I wonder, is that something you have looked into rather than growing the Karl Marx beard?
Oh, I don't see them as distinguished because I don't see, I'm not a command and control socialist. I'm very much a local cooperative socialist. So actually, this is what I was trying to get at, but didn't obviously express very well when I was answering Kim, and this idea of citizen engagement in production processes as well. So because you mentioned worker-owned cooperatives, but a lot of I have a friend who's a cooperative specialist, so I know that there's different kinds and stuff like that. But I think exactly these kinds of institutions that can be community-run, worker-run, consumer-run, a combination thereof, are really important and necessary. So basically, organisms that don't care about profit maximization, they don't care about competition. They care about
competition. They compete still on the market.
They might still compete, but if you have a housing association it's not going to be the same kind of thing, right? And cooperatives often collaborate a lot. I mean, you have alliances.
Okay. So maybe I expressed myself unclear. So the idea is, we do quite a lot of research on this at the Institute with some of the leading people on this. Is the idea is you still have a market economy and you still have companies producing for a market economy, and prices are set by demand and supply. But instead of having this Stockholm company, you have them controlled or owned by the employees. Even with that change, and you get this, I mean, there's something good with competition too, because it generates efficiency, and we need to become more efficient. But you seem to get.
It's not the only thing that does. I'm gonna channel Mariana Mazzucato.
Yeah, we certainly need to become more efficient if you don't want to have more climate change. I mean, that's one way of stopping climate change, by using less energy for producing what people need.
But the market is also the cause of a lot of inefficiency, like I was discussing with the sort of private provision. And the state and the public sphere are also great sources of innovation and efficiency. So Mariana Mazzucato, who had better get the Nobel Prize in economics one of these days, has done all these studies on the entrepreneurial state, right? That the state is also a location of great innovation, and so this distinction between private and public sphere.
No empirical example of the state being very good at running the whole economy. That's you get a planned economy. So you have to find.
No. I'm not talking about running the whole economy. I'm talking this. Again, these are extremes. But the state has a very strong role to play, and especially if it's localized, especially in various ways, the state can be very creative and very innovative, and the source of a lot of efficiency.
No one denies that, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's just, often there is when it's like, oh, you have to be in the market to innovate or be efficient. But I think that a combination of different structures is important.
It's very hard to get a good allocation without price signals. That's why the market economy is good. But you don't need to have a capitalist market economy. It's often a conflation between capitalism and market economy that we don't need to have.
I think it also depends on what you're talking about. So when you're talking about healthcare, I want zero markets. I want the national health system back.
Sure, I am too. There's a lot of studies showing that when there's not an easy exit for the consumer, you want to have maybe state or regional provisions. But when it comes, for example, to other things like shoes, the state is not very good at delivering the shoes that people want to have. It's better to leave
perfectly fine. But I think that it's a lot of and honestly, we were going to write a paper on this even, but it's one of the ones that stayed on the back burner, and it makes me sad all the time. Is that basically you need to think about this sectorally. So maybe provisioning systems is a nice way to think about this, because normally provision is tied to some kind of commodity. So you can think about it through your provisioning systems. What is the scale? What is the mechanism? Is it regional, or is it what level is regional? What level is wider? Like if you're going to be running hospitals and a health system, you probably need something at the national scale.
I think the point is lots of people have done this already. David Schweikart, Ellerman, all these people doing this stuff, and they're exactly doing that kind of analysis.
Yeah. My point is that there's probably not one solution, right? That it is probably depending on what you're trying to provision.
Yes.
You can have different social institutions that are cooperative or whatever, or state run or whatever. So it's about diversity, and I think the main principle for me would be so I'd be really interested in the references. If you can type them into the chat, that would be great. I'd be really interested in reading them. I didn't recognize the names off the top of my head.
As in a capitalist economy, no one has a pure capitalist economy, because we know that for getting the economy to work well, we need to have certain things provided by the state. Otherwise, it won't work. No one has yet, have a private military army.
But that dichotomy of private or state is also a bit weird, because you can have different scales and different ways of running things.
That's my point. That you shouldn't conflate a market economy with privately owned companies. They can be cooperative.
I'm going to give Julia the last word, and then we're going to call it a day on this.
Well, I think that we ended up in agreement, and I think at least in some sense maybe. But I think the main thing I think here is it's about economic democracy, which is something that I don't think we think about enough, because within sort of capitalist economies, we've given up a lot of decision-making power to markets, which are in fact determined by actors who are not the consumers, who are not the citizens. And I think that a lot of this comes back to having citizens make decisions, that we have the right as citizens to make decisions about the kind of economy that we would like to see around us, and we probably should have a democratic right to decide to have an economy that's not going to destroy the planet. So on that note, thank you for listening.
Very nice final concluding back and forth between Julia and Gustav. I thought that was a sort of, thesis, antithesis. Therefore, we somehow ended up at Hegel. And on that note...
it's terrible with Hegel there. Okay.
And for those of you who are here as seminar participants, I just need to let you know that we have upcoming research seminars on May 5th and May 19th. On May 5th, Marcus Yanti will be talking about trends in absolute intergenerational income mobility in Sweden. And then on May 19th, Karina Gunnarsson with a title that is still to be announced. I think that's it for items. I think we should just thank our speaker one more time, and also for taking a lot of difficult questions that were very annoying, I know. So thank you very much, Julia, for your time, and that was really fascinating.
Thanks, everybody.